mean, this is that by 2028, which is in 2 years from now, China will have 42% of the global mature nodes production capacity in the world. And so here's where I call this the Temu model of chips.
大家好，一直以来，西方国家在芯片制裁上都有一个非常自信的假设 ：EUV 光刻机的技术壁垒太高了，中国即使再努力，也至少需要5到10年才能赶上。但是他们可能忽略了一个致命的问题：如果中国根本就不打算按照你们的旧规则玩了呢？今天我们就来深度拆解一下西方对中国芯片的全面围堵是如何意外地逼出了一个能够改写全球科技格局的噩梦剧本。
From Huawei, which is pretty cool because He Tingbo, which is kind of the number one chip person at Huawei in terms of managerial level, she's been everywhere in Huawei, has been there for a long time. She came with a new model or a new principle to basically replace Moore's law. And I mean, for those people who don't know Moore's law, I mean, simply said, every 2 years, doubling of number of transistors on a chip. I mean, it's a lot more complicated, but that's kind of what makes it visually understandable. And that is when you go to 2 nanometer, 1 nanometer, I mean, you're getting at the atomic level where you just can't put more transistors on a chip. I mean, or make them smaller, let's put it this way. So Moore's law is getting challenged to continue. And so what she did, or what Huawei did, is instead of using geometrical scaling to make these transistors smaller, they wanted to use time scaling. And this is about compressing the signal propagation delay. So basically what they call the Tau, to continuously improve the transistor density and performance. Simply said, they basically, I looked it up in ChatGPT because for me it was also difficult to understand what this Tau law was, and they referred to it as maybe I should have used DeepSeek or Kimi, but I did ChatGPT, and they referred to it as if you have a city with a lot of people living in there, a dense city, in Moore's law, that's just adding more smaller cars to have them basically drive more people around. Well, what they're doing in Huawei is build skyscrapers. And so to have people live more dense towards each other, so the time to actually have the signal go from one place to another is much shorter. And so if you win time, you actually can actually have less challenges on the density capacity or the density limits that Lowe's Moore has. And so this is called logic folding. And this architecture breaks from the physical boundaries of the traditional circuit layouts. And so this is really looking at the next big thing. And I love it because what people probably, or what many probably don't realize, is that they've been using this for 5-6 years, this logic folding model. And Huawei claims that in the fall of 2026, the first new Kirin chip will come out completely with this Tau model. And in I think it's 2030, but I'm not convinced, or 31, they will go up to 1.4 nanometer in process. So that's just mind-blowing. Now, it is technically complicated, but it's interesting to see how China defies gravity pretty much by going into different directions. And I'm not surprised. But if this really takes off, if they can build this at capacity, of course, a lot of people will say it's probably going to be very difficult, it's not going to happen, whatever. But if they do, I think the US and NVIDIA and many will have a real challenge. And this will be a competitor for TSMC for sure. So this came out just a couple of days ago. I think it's this Tau scaling law is a proof of how China, just like IMEC and some others in the world, are basically defining the future on their own terms. And just like EVs, not sticking with combustion engines, you just go to that next big technology and you put your eggs in that basket. So really excited to see both the Huawei R&D Institute, but also what they did with it in the last 5-6 years, which we didn't have a clue about it. And this is just one of these things of China leapfrogging.
No, exactly. This is exactly the danger where we are sometimes too comfortable thinking, EUV lithography is so difficult that they will never crack the code, while they're just changing the laws of what we're optimizing for. And as you said, it's happening not only in chips, it's happening in different industries, like with EV. Instead of the internal combustion engine car, let's go to electric motor. Different USPs and value propositions are suddenly becoming the game changer. Then in smart home, you have the ecosystem instead just how well the phone functions. Then in robotics, you may have data loops more important in the future, how well the robotics brain works instead of how well this actuator is working, that sort of stuff. So there are many countless of these examples where I think we are really not watching close enough what China is doing and where the competition is going. And suddenly we find ourselves surprised how competitive these companies are, and then we resort to banning or protecting our markets sometimes, which I think it's just I'm just so passionate about innovation. So this for me it's always a little bit kind of a bummer to see, like if we're not having enough foresight to act on this and become better ourselves on innovating. That's kind of where I would like to ring the bell and sound the alarm, but because, for example, just there's regarding this breakthrough that you described by Huawei, there's a fun fact that there has been a Chinese PhD student who wrote a dissertation about just this idea in the 2000s, and none of the American and Taiwanese chip makers have been interested in that. And guess what? Where he is working now?
Huawei, I guess. Yeah. So, how did I guess that one?
How China is catching up, what we are watching, and always benchmarking. But these new ways they're going and how they're refusing to play by the old rules only, and how they're creating possibly a new tech stack. And what you just mentioned is fascinating, because it's also tells me that there is a ticking time bomb where we feel still relatively safe. As you just pointed out, it could be that they make a switch at any moment in time to domestic suppliers, and then suddenly this will have huge economic impact on some of our companies. So that's something very, very interesting to watch, in my opinion. But I think the takeaway must be
the narrative is also very clear. All of these chip companies that I visited, I visited only 3 of them, but they were all very humble, and they're all saying we're behind on the US and on TSMC and so it's not, or IBM or Google for quantum. So it's not that they say we are going to beat them, but there was one company which was called BrainCode, the brain computer interface. It's a completely different thing, and I visited them as well. And I loved their way of thinking. So they were established a year before Neuralink. I mean, it's a completely different topic. But their slogan is one thing it's the first time I saw this in China. And their slogan was, "We are not a follower." And I thought that says it all. Once the Chinese, and this to your point, once the Chinese actually say, "We are not a follower anymore," that's when you basically think things happen. Now, I want to end with one thing that I think in this chip industry is also very important to know, is that besides the catching up with the EUV and the leapfrogging with photonics and quantum and AI to build chips and all these new things and new materials, there's also one other thing that is critical to understand for the chip industry is the capacity building. And China is building capacity on fabs. In the last 5 years, since 2003, between 2003 2005, just in 3 years' time, they started 37 new chip fabs in China. This is more than the double of the US and Europe together. The capacity is crazy. It is expected.
Units here in Germany that are testing the hardware, and there have never been any backdoors or whatnot, but I don't want to go too much into the specifics. I think it's a lot about narrative. It's a lot about sending a signal, about making a point. It's basically telling all of these different companies, because there's not only Xiaomi, but there's a BYD, there's a NIO, there's many other companies who have in fact those chip designs or advanced products in many different fields. Hey, don't cross a certain border, or else you may feel a lot of pressure and heat from the sanctions side, in a sense. So I think the Chinese tech companies have become much more cautious about this. I think they're basically in a wait and see environment right now, where they are like, okay, we've seen what happened to Huawei, therefore we need to make up our own strategies, which are vertical integration, bring home the IP, do the R&D in China, and come up with something that cannot be taken away from us. And then we get into a position where either you take it or you don't. But we will have the lowest cost, we will have the most advanced, mass distributed, I don't know, AI chips, so both software and hardware. And I think that's where we are in this waiting stage, where they kind of know in the next couple of years they're gonna have such amazing breakthroughs that at some point it will be on us from the West, and on all of these different countries in the West, which are obviously not one voice, to decide which parts we want to import or work with China with, or the other ones we just can't get, right? So I think
you're right.
I think that's, if I immerse myself into the Chinese perspective, I think that's how they're thinking about it right now.
No, and I think that's the right thing. So we agree on that. It's really they're very cautious, but at the same time, I think what's interesting is that Huawei's blockade of getting chips and getting not just chips. I mean, it's also about the tools, the EDA tools to build these chips, the Cadence and Synopsys and Mentor Graphics, which is now Siemens, I believe. These are critical tools. So the whole ecosystem was blocked for Huawei. And this created, I would say 5-6 years ago, a whole chip industry in China, which wasn't driven by the government, but driven by the market. And because suddenly hundreds of companies were able to sell to Huawei. Before, all these startups were never able to sell to Huawei because Huawei just preferred to buy from someone else. And these are the same suppliers now selling to Xiaomi, BYD, EV, NIO, and all the others. So they're starting to become a very interesting change of this whole game. And this brings me to the trigger 5-6 years ago that many of these companies, as you said just now or before, is that they didn't want to catch up with the West anymore. They wanted to leapfrog to that next 50 years of what's going to happen.
Yeah, I would even extend on what you just said, in a sense, like I fully agree, like these sanctions or this whole geopolitical environment really has created the Chinese semiconductor industry in the first place. But not only that, like I've been talking since the beginning, since this happened, that this is really putting incentives for China into place to think in new ways and roads and come up with something that could be very, very dangerous in the end for us, because what we're talking about with the hardware and the chips now is only, I think, the second part of it. The first part we've already seen evolving with the breakthrough with DeepSeek, which essentially also is the result of Chinese AI companies having to navigate around a limited compute, right? So they go into software and algorithmic optimizations, and similar things we see that what you just described on the hardware side, like different ways of thinking about chips production, about packaging and whatnot. But I think what the US is still confident here, or also Europeans, are that they, lithography is so difficult. It will take them another 5 to 10 years to also catch up with the hardware side of things, because this is what I wanted to say, where it's becoming very dangerous. If they have both the software optimization stack and the open models at low cost and whatnot, plus more compute enabled through their own domestic ecosystem, this is the nightmare situation on a geopolitical side, where they basically would become not only totally independent, but also world leading in terms of technology, right? And I think this is where we maybe come to your next point, where we need to talk about also where Huawei and China in general is also thinking about leapfrogging different technologies, where maybe we're too focused even on the EUV and lithography stack.
Because I do believe this is something, and that's to your point of automotive. I mean, if everything comes at a better price, a faster delivery, and good quality, good enough for the products you need, I mean, why would we ask TSMC to build products that basically are going to be, because they will want to focus on the top end, and as long as the AI boom continues, I mean, that's what they're going to do, because the whole Taiwan is, the export is booming like crazy, but that's the only sector in Taiwan that is booming. Everything else is in decline. So I think it's very interesting to see how China is taking monopoly on the mature nodes industries. Jensen Huang even says it's 60%. I think he's exaggerating there a little bit of the mature nodes, but everything that is 28 nanometers and older, I think China is taking a monopoly like rare earths positioning. And specifically in the packaging, this is where China is building up a capacity like no country in the world can do, to package actually these chips together. And people don't always understand that the packaging is often as complicated as the whole chip development. And so they've been in Wuxi, the city very close to Shanghai. They now have more than 600 packaging companies in the chip industry. And this is just crazy. So this is something that I think we need to look at the three things at the same time: the catching up, the leapfrogging, but also how they're building the Temu model of chips and flooding the world with chips based on an ecosystem of chips that they've built, that they can build capacity at scale. And so I think we will need Musk to counter this if we want to do something about this.
Yeah, I think maybe the focus on this whole, the media narrative, how they're watching this competition, is maybe not deep enough in terms of that we think China needs to win by creating their own NVIDIA or TSMC or something. Instead, what you just described, this capacity building, is something which is happening in the background, because we could go, for example, talk about robotics, EVs, where also their own chips, the domestic chips, will be increasingly going into. So not only are they not only creating those new types of solutions based on different tech stacks that possibly will catch up at some point in time, but on top of that, they're building out this capacity and their own demand that they can, bring into a big scale in different various industries on top of that. So it's not really that they depend even on, us buying those chips at some point. It's rather feeding into a new established system that I think you need this type of perspective if you want to analyze and watch it, right? Because now, for example, all of these EV makers starting making their own chips, going possibly into those new humanoid robots, but on top of that, into self-driving cars. That's happening in a big way. So that's part of the semiconductor roadmap and layer for China, in a sense, right? So it's something that you see when you yourself and those executives are going to China. That's happening at a completely different scale and a different roadmap.
Yeah, and I think this is the storyline that we always have on second horizon. It's don't look just at what's happening at the top and the subsidies. Don't look at just the money that's been throwing around, the plans that Beijing has. I mean, it's all very important because it's the spark of many things. But if you look at the engineers, you look at the companies building things, how the market's defining it, the bottom up of private companies and smart people in ecosystems that are working together collectively, I think that's where the real tsunami is happening, even in the chip industry. And I think you're right. I think these are the signals that we need to look at. And the other signals are not untrue. I mean, Beijing is spending a lot of money and they have big plans. Everything's true. It's all true, but we're usually just blindsided by what's happening in how much Beijing is spending on money and how much the Chinese are wasting money and how many years they're behind in our models and so on. And so that's why I think the Huawei Tau model or scaling model is something that really changes the paradigm. And we've seen this a couple of years ago with, I think it was the Mate 60 when they had the first, I think it was 5 nanometer chip from Huawei, and everybody was like, this is impossible. How can they do this without EUV? And so I think we're going to see many more of this. And today it's still all leading to Huawei in many cases. But in a couple of years from now, I think this will lead to all the others like TuringQ and a lot of companies, CMXT, SME, all these companies that we've never ever heard about, that suddenly are going to do breakthroughs. So I think this was a fantastic overview in 1 hour time about the chip industry.
很多西方媒体依然在用过去的标尺来衡量中国落后了多少年。但他们没有意识到，中国正在搭建一套全新的技术战，这是一枚滴答作响的定时炸弹。中国企业现在非常低调、谨慎，处于观望与蛰伏的状态。一旦他们在核心技术上完成闭环，并在某一个时间点全面切换到本土供应商，将会对全球供应链和原有的科技巨头产生海啸般的经济冲击。留给西方躺在功劳簿上沾沾自喜的时间真的不多了。